We'll start with alif. So what sound does this letter make? That's easy. It's just like its English counterpart A in the word apple. Alif is very easy to write. It's basically a vertical stick. Okay, here we go. Alif. Let's get to know the different possible positions for a letter in Arabic. It's always one of four: isolated, initial, medial, or final. Let's look at each of them. Isolated means that the letter has no letters before it or after it. It's the standard form we learned just a few minutes ago. Initial means that the letter lies in the beginning of a word, so it's connected to the letter after it, but has no letters before it. Are you confused because the initial position connects to the letter to the left of it? That's because Arabic is written from right to left. Medial means that the letter is connected from back and front to other letters. And final means that the letter is the last letter in a word, so it's only connected to the letter before it. With the exception of 6 letters, we must learn the 4 possible forms for all the letters in the Arabic alphabet. Those 6 exception letters don't have a distinct medial form and are instead written with their final form without being connected to the next letter. Their initial form is the same as the isolated form. By the way, the letter we learned today happens to be one of those exceptions. That means we only have to learn 2 forms, isolated and final. You already learned the isolated version, so you just need to learn the final version. Let's write it. Alif. Now we will learn the final letter needed to write the word I in Arabic. That's noon. The noon is pronounced just like the English N. Pretty easy, right? It basically looks like a semicircle with a dot on top. Remember that this is the isolated form. Let's write it. Noon. You got lucky with your first letter, but noon requires that you learn all 4 forms. Let's get them all out of the way at once. So we have the initial form for when noon appears at the beginning of a word, the medial form for when it appears in the middle of a word, and the final form for when it's at the end. Now try to write all 3. Noon. Great! You've already learned 2 letters of the Arabic alphabet. I think you're ready to learn your first Arabic word. The word you learned to write today is ana. This word means I. The first alif is isolated because it's at the beginning of the word. The second and the third letters, noon and alif, are connected. You may have noticed that the alif at the beginning has a little mark on the top. When alif is at the beginning of the word, we add this mark to it, but it's still the alif sound. There's an exception to this rule, but you can read about it in the lesson notes, and we'll talk more about this mark in a later lesson, so don't worry too much. Now try to write it yourself. Ana. In this lesson, we learned these 3 letters. Note how they all look a lot like each other? This will help you memorize them. And because these have English counterparts, we know for sure that they are going to be easy to pronounce. Remember the noon we learned in the previous lesson? There are 2 differences between the noon and the 3 letters we're learning in this lesson. The first difference is the number and position of the dots. The second difference is that the isolated version of the noon dips beneath the line like this, while the 3 letters in this lesson don't. Our first letter of this lesson is ba, and yeah, it makes a B sound. You can remember this because the dot is below the boat shape. Let's study the different ways to write it together. Now you write it. Ba.
As we studied in the previous lesson, there are many forms for every letter in Arabic. The letter ba has 4 possible positions: isolated, initial, medial, and final. Let's see the remaining 3: initial, medial, final. Now we'll write them. Ba. That's all there is to ba. Let's move on. The second letter you'll learn in this lesson is another one that looks like ba. Ta. As you can see, the only difference is in the position and the number of the dots. The pronunciation is like the English T, except you should release your breath with a strong burst of air. Try it. Ta. Here's how to write the isolated version. Ta. This letter also has 4 possible positions: isolated, initial, medial, and final. Let's see the remaining 3. Okay, let's write them. Ta. Now let's finish up this lesson with the third letter of this group. Our final letter is tha. That's like the TH in the English word thief. Pretty easy, right? Tha has 3 dots on top of the boat-like letter, written in a triangle-like shape. Tha carries an extra letter, so we add a third dot. A third dot like 3. Here's how to write the isolated version. Tha. You're almost there. Here are the remaining variations of this letter: initial, medial, and final. Once you practice writing these a few times, they won't seem so difficult. Tha. Well done! I think you're ready to learn a new word. Can you read this? It's pronounced ab. This is the word for father in Arabic. The first letter is an isolated alif. We learned that in the previous lesson. Then there's an isolated ba. Pretty easy, huh? Now let's practice writing it. Ab. Now it's time for Carol's tips. Here's a useful reminder for memorizing the characters we've learned in this lesson. For the letter ba, the dot is below the line, and for the letters ta and tha, the dots are at the top. Be sure to add ana and ab to your notebook. We'll be learning new words in each lesson. In this lesson, we'll learn how to read and write 3 letters that look alike. Writing them should be easy, but pronouncing them is the most challenging part. Our first letter is jim. This one is easy to pronounce. It's somewhere between a G and a J, depending on the accent. For example, Standard Arabic, Syrian, or Egyptian. In Standard Arabic and Syrian Arabic, it should sound like the J in the word jam, while in Egyptian Arabic, it sounds like the G in the word game. They're both quite easy to pronounce though. Now let's handwrite the isolated form. Jim. Here are the initial, medial, and final versions of jim. Now we'll write them. Jim. The second letter we learn in this lesson is ha. As you can see, it looks like the jim, but without the dot in the hook. But of course, it doesn't sound like it. Ha is the first letter of the second group, meaning that it has no counterpart in English. It sounds like the sound you make when trying to cool your mouth and throat after eating something very spicy. The closest English counterpart to the sound is H. The only difference is that it comes from a point deeper down in your throat, just like this. Try it yourself. Here's how to write the isolated version. Ha. Here are the initial, medial, and final versions of ha. Now we'll write them. Ha. The last letter we learn here is the kha. This letter, like the ha, has no English counterpart. Kha is a sound some people make when they laugh. It's also similar to the sound people make when they snore. According to phonetic charts, ha is pronounced in a deeper part of the throat than kha. Listen and repeat. Kha. Kha. Both kha and ha have no English counterparts. They're a bit tricky to pronounce, so let's practice these two letters in some words. First, a word which has kha is khad. Khad means cheek in English. And one that has ha is had. Had means limit. Can you hear the difference between khad and had? It might take some time before you can hear the differences clearly, so don't worry about it too much. Here's how to write the isolated version. Kha. Kha. Let's learn a word using some of these letters. Taj. Repeat after me. Taj. Taj means crown. That's ta in the initial form, alif in the final form, and jim in the isolated form, disconnected from the alif before it, because as we learned in the first lesson, the alif connects differently. Now let's try writing it. Taj. First, write the ta. The boat connected to the alif, the two dots, then the jim in the isolated form. Nice work! Practice writing some words from the letters we've learned so far. Try the following. Najaha, meaning to succeed. Jan, meaning side. Hajj, meaning pilgrimage. In this lesson, we'll continue by learning two more letters that look alike. After that, we'll learn a few more words to add to your notebook. Ready? Let's go! Our first letter is dal. It's just like the English D. Very easy to pronounce and easy to write as well. Here's the isolated form. Dal. It's a single stroke. You start from the top and then form a right angle. And that's it, done. Just like the alif we learned, the initial form of this letter is just like its isolated form, and the medial form is like the final form. Now we'll write it. Dal. The second letter we learn in this lesson looks like the previous letter, dal. It's the dal. Note how it does not dip beneath the line. We'll learn 2 letters in the next lesson that dip beneath the line. That's why you should make sure you differentiate between them. This letter is like the th sound in the word this. Do you remember that we learned another letter corresponding to the English th sound? It was tha, and it's pronounced as a silent th, as in thief. This letter's pronunciation is a voiced sound, the, as in this or that. It's pronounced with the tongue between the upper and the lower teeth. It's quite easy to pronounce. Here's how to write the isolated version. Dhal. Now let's see how it looks like in its other forms. As you can see, it's just like its lookalike, dal. The initial form is the same as the isolated, and the medial form is the same as the final. If you know how to write dal, then you just need to add a dot to write dal. Handwriting time. Dal. First up is the word jad. It means grandfather. That's the jim we learned in the previous lesson in initial form, connected to the dal we learned in this lesson in its final form. Okay, now try writing it. Jad. Let's start with the jim, then connect it to the dal. Great job! Let's try another word. Ida means if. We learned the alif in the first lesson and the dal in this lesson. Here you can see that little mark from lesson 1 is now at the bottom of alif and has changed the sound to an E. Don't worry too much about it for now. Now let's try writing it by hand. إذا. Now it's time for Carol's tips. Handwriting is kind of like a signature in every language, and no two people's handwriting is the same. It's better to learn the basics and the standard form of the alphabet and get used to it first, then develop your own style. Good luck! In this lesson, we learned 2 letters that look alike and also kind of look like the 2 letters in the previous lesson. Then we'll learn a few more words for you to add to your notebook. Ready to learn? Then let's go. Our first letter is ra. Its closest English counterpart is the letter R, but it's a different sound that must be learned. Ra. It's not too hard to pronounce though, right? Note how it looks like the dal, but dips beneath the line. Make sure not to confuse them. Here's the isolated form. Ra. Now let's take a look at the other forms. Just like the alif, dal, and zal, the letters in this lesson connect differently. The isolated one is like the initial form, and the medial version is like the final one. Now we'll write it. Ra. The second letter we learn in this lesson looks pretty familiar. Zayn. As you can see, it looks similar to the ra, but with a dot on top. In terms of pronunciation, you say it just like the English z, as in zebra, or Al Jazeera. Practice saying Al Jazeera if you want to practice both the sounds ra and zayn at the same time. It's the perfect word for it. Al Jazeera. Here's how to write the isolated version. Zayn. Start from the top, divot below the line, then put a dot on top. Done. Now let's take a look at the other forms of Zayn. You can probably guess that the isolated version is like the initial and the medial is like the final. Now let's write it. Zayn. First up is the word that uses two of our new letters. Try reading it out loud. It should be easy. It's pronounced jazar and means carrot. The jim is connected to the zayn, but the ra and the zayn aren't connected to each other because they are in medial and final positions. Now let's try writing it. Jazar. Now let's try to write another word. It's rad, meaning reply, like when you're replying to an email or message or someone talking. This verb uses only two letters and both are written like isolated letters. Let's write it. Rad. The last word we have in this lesson is the verb zara, which means visited. Note how all the three letters in this word connect differently, and so they are all isolated. Let's write it together. Zara. Now it's time for Carol's tips. Grouping letters into those with similar characteristics makes memorizing them much easier. Just make sure you don't confuse them. Some letters look very much alike, the only difference is dots and their position. By reading more, you'll get used to the difference between the letters and their pronunciation. Good luck! First, we'll review the basic rules. In this series, we've classified the Arabic alphabet into two groups. The first one is the group of the letters with counterparts in English language. The second one is the group of the letters that don't have counterparts in English. That means they will be a bit more challenging to pronounce, but remember, practice makes perfect. Letters of the Arabic alphabet have four ways to connect to the letters before and after them: isolated, initial, medial, and final. However, there are letters that don't follow that rule and only have two forms of connection. They are alif, dal, dhal, ra, zayn, waw. Now let's review the letters we've learned so far. In the first lesson, we learned alif and noon. They are the letters you need to form the word ana, meaning the pronoun I. First, we have alif. Here's the isolated form. And here's the final form. Alif only has two forms, as we've already explained before. Now let's review noon. Isolated, initial, medial, and final. That's it for the first lesson. Did you remember that the initial form of alif is the same as the isolated form, and the medial form is the same as the final form? Now let's move on to the next lesson. In the second lesson, we learned ba, ta, and tha. First, we have ba. Isolated, initial, medial, final. Then there's ta. Isolated, initial, medial, final. Finally, we have tha. Isolated, initial, medial, final. That's it for lesson 2. Their shapes look like a boat, remember? Next, let's review lesson 3. In the third lesson, we learned 3 more letters that look alike: jim, ha, and kha. Here's jim: isolated, initial, medial, final. Now let's check ha: isolated, initial, medial, final. Finally, we have kha: isolated, initial, medial, final. That's it for lesson 3. Next, let's review lesson 4. In the fourth lesson, we learned dal and dal. First, we have the dal: isolated and initial, medial and final. Now let's check the dal: isolated and initial, medial and final. That's it for lesson 4. These letters are 2 of the 6 which only have 2 forms. Finally, let's review lesson 5. In the fifth lesson, we learned ra and zayn. These 2 letters also have only 2 forms. First, we have ra: isolated, initial, medial, final. Then there's zayn: isolated, initial, medial, final. And that's the end of our review for the first 5 lessons. Did you remember most of them? Keep practicing and you'll get better in no time. Now we'll continue with some Arabic writing rules. To be able to read Arabic correctly, you also need to master the voweling system of the Arabic language. Voweling signs are marks above or beneath the letter that adds a vowel sound to that letter. However, vowels in the voweling signs are pronounced shorter than the actual vowels. Let's see the 3 basic voweling signs when used with ba. First, here's the fatha. The pronunciation will now be ba. Next, this is a kasra. This is now pronounced as bi. And finally, here's a dhamma. It changes the pronunciation to bu. Now, let's practice writing and pronouncing these basic voweling signs. Akh, brother. Akh. Ukht, sister. Ukht. Jad, grandfather. Jad. Ana, I. Ana. Anta, you. Anta. Voweling is very important because it can change a word's meaning. For example, here are 2 words that have the same letters but are pronounced differently and have different meanings because of the difference in voweling. Har means hot, while hur means free. There are other voweling signs in Arabic, but they aren't as common as the 3 basic signs we learned in this lesson. We'll go back to them in the next review lesson. Now it's time for Carol's tips. The concept of voweling might feel a bit unnatural to non-native speakers. However, Arabic learners need voweling to be able to read correctly, especially when faced with new words. Native speakers don't need voweling because they know the words and how they're pronounced already. From now on, we are going to write the words we learn with voweling, so get ready. Let's go! In this lesson, we'll continue with 2 letters from the first group, meaning that they have English counterparts, which is good news for us. Those are sin and Sheen. Let's start with seen. Seen sounds just like the English S. It's very easy to pronounce. Let's see how it's written. Here's the isolated version. Seen. Now let's see the rest of the letter forms. Initial, medial, and final. Let's write them. Seen. The next letter we learn is sheen. This one is pronounced just like the English sh in the word shovel. This one is very easy as well. It looks just like the seen, except that it has 3 dots on top in a triangular formation, like the tha we learned in lesson 2. Let's write it down in the isolated form. Sheen. Now let's see the rest of the forms. Initial, medial, final. Here's how to write them. Sheen. Note how seen and sheen dip underneath the line when they are in the isolated and final forms, just like the noon we learned in the first lesson of this series. Now let's learn some words using these 2 letters and the letters we learned before. First we have sir, meaning secret. Seen is in the initial form with a kasra beneath, connected to ra in the final form. Here's how to write it. Sir. The next word we have is shariba. It means to drink. Sheen is in the initial form with a fatha on top, connected to ra in the final form, with a kasra beneath, then ba in the isolated form. Writing time. Shariba. Now it's time for Carol's tips. Taking note of letters that dip beneath the line and letters that don't can help improve your handwriting. The letters we learned so far that dip beneath the line are ra, zayn in all their forms, and noon, sin, sheen in their isolated and final forms. Also, it's best to practice on lined paper, not blank paper, for more structured handwriting. The first letter we have in this lesson is Sod. The Sod is basically the strong version of the Sin we learned in the last lesson, and it kind of sounds like the S in the word saw. This sound is pronounced with your throat constricted. Listen to Sod and Sin with the vowel Alif we learned in the first lesson. Saw, sa. Hear the difference? You'll have to do this for a few more letters later on, so please get used to using your throat like this. Let's write it down in the isolated version. Sod. Here are the initial, medial, and final forms of this letter. Now we'll write them. Sad. The next letter we learn is Dodd. This one is like a strong version of the dal, kind of like the D in the word daughter. It looks just like the sad, except that it has a dot on top. The difference between this letter and dal is the same as the difference between sad and sin, with your throat constricted. Dodd. Here's how to write it in the isolated form. Dodd. Now let's check the rest of the forms. Initial, medial, final. Here's how to write them. Dodd. These two letters also dip underneath the line when they are in the isolated and final form, just like these other letters. Do you remember them? Now, let's learn two new words which use the letters we've learned so far. Our first word is sabr. It means patience. Sad is in the initial form with a fatha on top. Then we have the ba in the medial form without voweling, connected to ra in the final form. Here's how to write it. Sabr. Our next word is darar. It means damage. It's Dodd in the initial form with a fatha on top, followed by ra in the final form with a fatha on top, and ra in the isolated form. Let's see how we write this word. Darar. The first letter we have in this lesson is ta. This one sounds like the strong version of the letter ta we learned in the second lesson of this series. It kind of sounds like the T in the name Tom. When you pronounce it, try to constrict your throat like you did with sad. Let's practice it together so that you can see the difference. Repeat after me. Ta, ta. Let's write the isolated form. Ta. Here are the other forms of ta. Initial, medial, and final. Now let's write the other forms. Ta. The next letter we learn is dha. This one is like the strong version of the dal. It looks just like the ta, except that it has a dot on top. Let's practice this one together as well. Repeat after me. Dal, dha. Now let's write it down. Dha. Now let's see the other forms of dha. Initial, medial, and final. Handwriting time. Dha. Okay, now let's learn some words using the letters that we've learned. Let's start with the word tip. This means medicine. Ta is in the initial form with a kasra at the bottom. Then we have the ba in the final form. Let's learn how to write it.
Tip.
Our second word is hadh, which means luck. But you don't need luck to form this word. It's easy. It's just a ha in the initial form with a fatha on top connected to the dha in the final form. Let's write it down. Hadh. Now it's time for Carol's tips. Unlike the letters we've learned before, all the forms of ta and dha look very similar. But remember, not all the Arabic letters are like this. It's important to memorize all of the forms of the letters and not just their isolated forms. Practice by reading some Arabic text on the internet, in magazines, or even on the packaging of Arabic products. The first letter we have in this lesson is Ayn. It looks like a mirror image of the number 3, but it dips beneath the line in the isolated and final forms. Ayn doesn't sound like any other letter in the Arabic or English alphabet. The sound comes from a very deep part in the throat. Let's practice it together. Repeat after me. Ayn. Let's write the isolated form. Ayn. Now let's see the other forms of Ayn. Take note how they all look a bit different. Initial, medial, final. Let's see how we write them. Ayn. The next letter we learn is Ghain. This one is like the French R. It looks just like the Ain, except that it has a dot on top. Its sound is similar to the sound you make when you gargle, a sound that comes from a point deep in the throat. Listen carefully. Ghain. Let's write it down in the isolated version. Ghain. Now for the rest of the forms, initial, medial, and final. Let's write them down. Ghain, Now let's learn some words using these two letters combined with some of the letters we learned before. Our first word is abra, meaning through. Ayn is in the initial form with a fatha on top. Then we have the ba in the medial form without voweling, connected to the ra in the final form with a fatha on top. Let's write it. Abra. The next word is ghadr, which means betrayal. Ghain is in the initial form with a fatha on top, connected to a final dal with no voweling, then ra in the isolated form. Let's write it down. Ghadr. Now it's time for Carol's tips. In this lesson, you learned the letter Ayn. Ayn is also the Arabic word for eye. For example, the expression al-ayn bil-ayn was sin bis-sin means eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. We'll have a review. In the past 4 lessons, you learned several letters with sounds that you have never heard or pronounced before. Do you remember the letters we learned in lesson 7? They were sin and sheen. Both of them are very easy to pronounce. First, we have sin, the isolated form, and the other 3 forms: initial, medial, final. Now let's review sheen. Isolated, initial, medial, final. That's it for lesson 7. Now on to lesson 8's letters. In lesson 8, we learned Sod and Dodd. Here's the Sod. Isolated, initial, medial, final. And then the Dodd. Isolated, initial, medial, final. Next, let's review lesson 9. We learned ta and dha. First, we have the ta. Isolated, initial, medial, final. Now here's the dha. Isolated, initial, medial, and final. And now here are the letters we learned last lesson. Ayn and ghain. First, let's review Ayn. Isolated, initial, medial, final. Finally, let's see ghain one more time. Isolated, initial, medial, final. That's it for these lessons. Did you remember most of them? Keep practicing and you'll get better. Now it's time to learn another voweling sign. In the previous review lesson, we learned the fatha, dhamma, and kasra. In this lesson, we will learn the shadda. Unlike in English, to repeat the same sound twice in Arabic, you don't use the same letter twice in a row. Instead, you use the shadda symbol. So, if you see a symbol that looks like a 3 on its side on top of a letter, then it means that that letter is to be pronounced twice. The shadda could also be used in combination with the fatha, dhamma, and kasra. First, here's how the fatha shadda combination looks like when used with ba. And here's the dhamma shadda combination. Finally, here's the kasra shadda combination. Take note that the kasra is put below the shadda and not the letter like when it's used on its own. Also, make sure that you don't confuse it with the fatha shadda combination, wherein the fatha is on top of the shadda. Now let's learn how to write and pronounce some new words that use shadda. Barrad, refrigerator. Barrad. Habbar, cuttlefish. Habbar. Sabbar, cactus. Sabbar. Attar, spice dealer. Attar. The first letter we're going to learn today is fa. Fa is pronounced just like the English F. Notice how this letter has one dot on top of the circle-like part because the next letter will look a bit like it, but not quite. Let's write the isolated form. Fa. Here are the other forms of fa. Initial, medial, final. Now it's time to write them. Fa. Let's move on to the second letter, qaf. The qaf looks a bit like the previous letter fa, except it has two dots and a shorter and more curved tail. It also dips beneath the line. Think about the word call and notice how it comes from deep in the throat. It's a stronger version of the letter K, said with the throat constricted like in Sad and Dodd. Now let's handwrite the isolated form. Qaf. Here are the initial, medial, and final versions of qaf. Now we'll write them. Qaf. That's it for our 2 letters. Now let's learn a couple of words using them. Our first word is Farah. This word can mean 2 things, happiness or wedding. Fa is in the initial form with a fatha on top, ra in the final form, also with a fatha on top, and then a ha in the isolated form. Let's write it. Farah. Let's learn another word. Farq means difference. Here we have a fa in the initial form with a fatha on top. Then we have a ra in the final form, followed by a qaf in the isolated form. Here's how to write it. Farq. In this lesson, we learned 2 new letters of the first group that will be very easy to write and pronounce. They also kind of look alike. Ready to learn? Then let's go. The first letter we're going to learn today is kaf. The kaf is pronounced just like the English K. Here's how to write the isolated form. Kaf. Let's look at the other forms of kaf. Initial, medial, final. Note how the isolated and final versions of this letter are very different from the initial and medial versions. The first 2 look like a hook with a little mark inside, while the second 2 look like an arrowhead pointing to the left. This is one of the few letters in Arabic that have very different forms, depending on their position in the word. Now we'll write them. Kaf. Our second letter for this lesson is lam. It looks a bit like the previous letter, kaf, in its isolated and final forms. The lam sounds like the English L. Very easy to pronounce, right? Now let's handwrite the isolated form. Lam. Here are the other forms of lam. Initial, medial, final. Okay, let's write them. Lam. Can you see the main differences between the 2 letters we learned in this lesson? There are 2 main differences between kaf and lam. The kaf doesn't dip underneath the line, while the lam in its isolated and final form does. The other difference is the little mark in kaf. Great job! Now let's take what we've learned so far and look at some examples that we can write. The first word is kataba. It means to write in the past tense. Kaf is in the initial form with a fatha on top, followed by a ta in the medial form, again with a fatha on top, and then a ba in the final form, also with a fatha. Let's try and write it together. Kataba. The second word is فعل. It means to do in the past tense. Here we have a fa in the initial form, ayn in the medial form, and a lam in the final form. Just like the previous kataba, all of the letters have a fatha. Let's write it down. فعل. Now it's time for Carol's tips. When practicing your Arabic writing at home, it's a great idea to sound out the words as you write them. This helps you get used to reading Arabic letters and saying the sounds out loud. For learners, pronunciation is more challenging than writing. If you've been silent up to this point, try to say the words from this lesson now. كتب, فعل. If you're not used to saying Arabic, you'll probably make a few mistakes, but that's all part of learning. In this lesson, we're going to learn one new letter from the first group and review one which we have tackled in the first lesson. They are mim and noon. Note how kaf, lam, mim, noon are arranged just like in the English alphabet, K, L, M, N. This should make it easier for you to memorize the Arabic alphabet. Now let's start with our first letter, mim. This letter sounds just like the English M, and it should be pretty easy to pronounce. Let's write it in the isolated form. Mim. Now let's see the other possible forms. Initial, medial, final. It's basically a circle, and the way it connects to the letters around it depends on its position. Here's how to write them. Mim. Now let's see the next letter. It's noon. We learned noon at the beginning of the series, together with alif, in order to form ana. Do you remember what ana means? Right, it means I. The noon sounds just like the English N. Let's remember how to write it together. Noon. Here's the isolated form. And here's the initial form. Here's the medial form. And then the final form. Do they look familiar? I hope you remembered them. Now, let's learn a couple of new words using mim, noon, and some letters we've previously learned. Our first word is makan, meaning place. Here we have a mim with a fatha on top, connected to a kaf. Then we have an alif in the final form because it doesn't have a medial form. After this is noon in the isolated form because it cannot be connected directly to the alif. Let's learn how to write it together. Makan. For our next word, we have nar. This means fire. Noon is in the initial form, connected to a final alif, which, as we've seen, does not connect to the letter after it. So for the last letter, we have an isolated ra. Let's write it. Nar. In this lesson, we learned two letters that are going to help you to better understand an important aspect of the Arabic language, feminine and masculine words. These should help you conjugate verbs and adjectives easily. These two letters are ta and ha. Are you ready to write them? Then let's go. Let's start with our first letter, ha. This letter sounds just like the English H, and it should be very easy to pronounce. Try it. Ha. Let's write it in its isolated form. Ha. Let's look at the other forms of ha. Initial, medial, final. Unlike the ta and the dha we learned in lesson 9, every version of this letter looks different. Pay attention. Here's how to write them. Ha. The next letter for this lesson is ta. As you can see, it looks very similar to the previous one, but it has two dots on top. This letter can only exist at the end of a word. This means that it can only be in the final or in the isolated form. Both forms are written just like their look-alike letter, ha, but with the two additional dots. Ta can also be tricky because its pronunciation varies depending on its position in a sentence. It can be either an H or a T. The rule of thumb is that as long as the word is pronounced alone and not in a sentence, then it's pronounced as an H. Let's try writing ta. Isolated, final. When you see this letter appearing at the end of any word, it means that this word is feminine, be it a noun or an adjective. Keep this in mind because it's going to help you a lot when you start learning Arabic grammar. And that's it for this lesson's letters. I hope this wasn't too complicated. Now, let's learn a couple of new words using the new letters we've just learned. Our first word is sahl, meaning easy. Here we have an initial sin with a fatha on top, connected to a ha in medial form, which is connected to lam in the final form. Let's see how to write it. Sahl. Next we have lugha, a very important word meaning language. Lam is in the initial form with a dhamma on top, connected to a medial ghain with a fatha on top, connected to a ta in the final form. Let's write it. Lugha. Now it's time for Carol's tips. You may be thinking that we've already learned ta in an earlier lesson. You're right. In the second lesson, we learned ta, which looks like this. Remember? The name is the same, and it's pronounced the same. So why do we even have this new ta? It's because the ta we learned in this lesson is used as a grammatical marker. Like I said before, when a word ends with this letter, it means it's a feminine word. So you may be confused about it now, but when you get into more complicated Arabic grammar, you will find it very helpful.